Russia's hybrid war against Ukraine began long before the full-scale invasion. Back in 2014, as it massed troops along Ukraine's borders, the Kremlin deployed the full arsenal of terrorist methods: cyber espionage, cyber sabotage, phishing attacks to steal confidential information, both state and personal. Today, cyber attacks have taken the form of full-fledged military operations. Through hackers tied to state structures and private contractors, the Kremlin strikes at civilian and military infrastructure in Ukraine and across Europe. These actions serve one purpose: espionage, data theft, destabilization. Russia's war against Ukraine is turning into the first war in history fought in cyberspace. How are Russian hacker groups organized? Who is behind the massive cyber attacks on Ukraine and European states? And what impact do they have on Ukraine's and the world's digital security? In May 2025, Ukraine's State Special Communications Service, together with the IC Task Force think tanks, presented a report on the threats and trends of cyber warfare. The focus: the evolution of Russian tactics since 2022. According to the report, Russian intelligence gradually shifted from isolated local attacks to massive, systemic cyber operations, now a key element of its military strategy. The Kremlin increasingly involves private IT companies and hacker groups around the globe in its cyber war. Since February 2022, the SBU has recorded more than 10,000 cyber attacks. Russians not only strike at Ukraine's and Europe's vital digital infrastructure, but also steal the secret information of states.
In practice, it is mainly the GRU, Russia's main intelligence directorate, and the FSB behind these operations. These agencies have been recruiting people since at least 2005 and continue to do so. They constantly seek individuals to connect to their networks. Beyond that, the Kremlin heavily relies on the private sector. Russia has numerous major cybersecurity companies, including research firms exploring vulnerabilities and new attack methods. Cooperation with these companies is actively cultivated, allowing the state to tap domestic resources and distribute tasks efficiently. One division researches, another identifies targets, and a third figures out how to apply tools in real operations. It is a whole ecosystem in which state structures and the so-called private sector are intertwined, and where tasks are divided as in a military campaign.
One of the key tactics is the so-called DDoS attack, blocking access to critical online resources for both civilians and the military, including intelligence services. Power grids are paralyzed, infrastructure and civilian communications disrupted. Targets include financial institutions, banking systems, and payment platforms. Attackers either steal funds or block access to them. This is the new face of war, cyber wars of the 21st century.
Today, all of us are citizens of the digital world. Perhaps some developing countries are not yet fully immersed, but the more advanced an economy is, the deeper it is integrated into the digital sphere. And that digital reality is extremely difficult to control, especially in how it penetrates the human mind, shaping choices during elections. Take the Baltic states. Their societies are among the most digitized in the world, from municipal services to defense systems, and all of it needs protection. In the West, we already see how vulnerable elections are, with Russian interference recorded time and again. Romania has provided examples, and more recently Moldova. Even though their parliamentary elections are scheduled only for October, cases of electoral manipulation through cyber channels and digital technologies have already been documented. Poland is another striking case. Warsaw itself has declared openly that it is engaged in a cyber war with Russia. During the recent elections, the Polish government was even forced to adopt a special plan, a national cybersecurity program tailored specifically to safeguard the electoral process. This shows how deeply digital interference has embedded itself into the democratic systems of Europe.
In 2007, Russian hackers launched a massive cyber attack on Estonia after the government moved the Bronze Soldier Monument from central Tallinn to a military cemetery. They defaced and deleted government websites. A year later, in 2008, on the eve of Russia's invasion of Georgia, Moscow again turned to cyber weapons. The first targets were state websites and independent media. Through such actions, the Kremlin destabilizes societies while damaging or even destroying critical digital systems. Cyberspace once had local boundaries. Today its reach is far broader, and so are the threats coming from Russia.
Through methods of information warfare and cyber attacks, and it's no longer even war in the conventional sense, the opponent often doesn't even realize Russia is waging war against them. Europe only realized it after the fact, during elections. By then, Russia had already flooded them with disinformation, mobilized proxy groups, created fake outlets online, pumped content into TikTok. In Romania, a candidate literally won the first round with TikTok's help. This is the gray zone, an architecture of influence and intrusion that is largely invisible in real time. You rarely detect it in advance. You perceive it only post hoc, when patterns emerge and consequences crystallize. That invisibility is part of its power. While democracies are still diagnosing the problem, adversaries have already exploited the levers of influence. By the time they realize their infrastructure is already under your control, their elections are manipulated, their state effectively compromised.
The first confirmed cyber attack in history to cause a mass power outage came in December 2015, when Russian hackers broke into the control system of the Prikarpatya Oblastnaya Energo Power Company. Over 200,000 residents of Ivano-Frankivsk region were left in the dark. The attack began with phishing emails that delivered malicious code. Hackers then seized control of substation management systems, destabilizing power supply across the region.
At that time, almost no one in the world knew how to carry out cyber attacks of this kind, apart from the famous operation against Iran's nuclear program in 2011. No state officially claimed responsibility for that incident. Likewise, in 2015, no one stepped forward to admit responsibility for the attacks on Ukraine. But those strikes marked the beginning of a new era, the first truly modern cyber attacks in our region. From a technical perspective, the methods used were relatively primitive. Yet the weakness of Ukraine's cyber defenses, especially at the state level and in critical infrastructure, made even such simple actions produce significant results. The consequences were not catastrophic, but they were weighty enough to make clear that a new phase of conflict had begun. In effect, an active stage of cyber warfare opened both on Ukrainian territory and in Ukrainian cyberspace. And that conflict has continued to evolve and intensify ever since.
In June 2017, Ukraine was hit by one of the most destructive cyber attacks ever. Hackers tied to Russian military intelligence unleashed the so-called NotPetya worm, a piece of malware disguised as ransomware but designed primarily to destroy. Its targets included some of the country's most critical enterprises, energy companies, transport hubs, banks, and key government agencies. The attack disrupted airports and the Kiev metro. The infection spread through the update system of an accounting program.
The NotPetya attack represented the next step in this evolution. Here, the attackers used a far more complex and sophisticated approach, a strike on a software supplier whose products were used across virtually the entire country. In cybersecurity terminology, this is called a supply chain attack. By compromising a trusted company, they gained access to countless other organizations. The result was chaos. For several days, the functioning of the entire state was seriously disrupted. Tens of thousands of computers and vast numbers of businesses, agencies, and institutions were paralyzed. It was a wake-up call that defense could no longer be built around individual organizations in isolation. Security had to extend to the entire ecosystem. The NotPetya incident proved that cyber warfare had evolved far beyond localized acts of sabotage and now had the power to disrupt the daily life of an entire nation.
On the eve of the full-scale invasion, Russia once again turned to cyber weapons, crippling satellite communications. Hackers disabled modems that provided internet access for tens of thousands in Ukraine. State and banking websites were struck, along with critical infrastructure, using the hermetic wiper virus. These attacks were part of the invasion's preparation. In January 2023, Ukraine's State Special Communications Service studied the link between cyber attacks, political events, and frontline developments. The analysis revealed a clear pattern. Waves of Russian missile strikes were often synchronized with cyber attacks, creating a double blow aimed at overwhelming defenses. Media outlets, communication hubs, logistics networks, and energy companies, the very backbone of a country at war.
We repeatedly saw how cyber attacks were coupled with missile strikes or with attempts to advance on the battlefield. These combined operations, what military specialists call information psychological operations, or IPSO, are used in tandem with cyber strikes to destabilize a country. For instance, when Ukraine's key targets such as Kyivstar, the Ministry of Justice, or Ukrainian railways were hit, Russian bot networks simultaneously spread panic online, amplifying the message that everything in Ukraine was collapsing. The attack on Ukrainian railways is a striking example. Its timing coincided almost exactly with the first round of peace negotiations in Istanbul. It is very likely that the strike was meant to serve as a lever in global diplomatic maneuvering, a demonstration that Russia could destabilize Ukraine not only with missiles, but also in cyberspace. Since the railways are absolutely critical to the nation's functioning, the entire country felt the impact at once.
In December 2023, one of Ukraine's largest telecom operators came under a massive cyber attack, one of the most disruptive to date. Millions of people were cut off from mobile networks and the internet. Hackers destroyed thousands of virtual servers. Restoring normal operations proved immensely difficult and took several weeks, during which entire regions struggled with outages and communication breakdowns. The main goal, a psychological blow against Ukraine's population. Cyber warfare is becoming increasingly drawn out and unpredictable. Two factors drive this: the accessibility and simplicity of attack tools, and the rapid growth of technology and artificial intelligence. Ukraine, however, is not just defending, it is striking back. At the end of January 2024, Russia's Sberbank suffered the longest cyber operation in its history. A DDoS attack lasted 4 days, effectively paralyzing the institution.
Over these 3.5 years of war, I can identify two main types of cyber attacks, perhaps even three. First are the typical sabotage operations, such as DDoS attacks, designed to take websites offline or disrupt specific services temporarily. These are the most common and easiest to recognize. Then there are destructive attacks. Once attackers gain access to infrastructure, they can systematically disable or destroy entire systems, as we saw with strikes on Kyivstar, the Ministry of Justice in Ukraine, and the recent attacks on Aeroflot. Finally, there are reconnaissance operations, which are subtler but no less important. Destructive attacks are complex and carefully orchestrated, unfolding much like battlefield operations conducted by sabotage reconnaissance units. They begin with reconnaissance, gathering intelligence on the target, its systems and vulnerabilities. Once enough information is collected, the attackers plan the operation in detail, determining how to penetrate the enemy's infrastructure effectively. After entering the system, they carry out further reconnaissance to map out what exists within the territory they've breached. Only then is the destructive action finally executed. In practice, however, the reconnaissance and destructive phases rarely follow a clean sequence. They overlap, repeat. The key distinction lies in the outcome. A destructive attack disrupts infrastructure, draws attention, and inevitably exposes the attacker's presence. A reconnaissance operation, by contrast, is built on patience and persistence. It can continue quietly for years, with operatives maintaining hidden access, mapping systems, and harvesting information on a continuous basis.
Despite the fact that some Russian attacks succeeded, the Ukrainian state continues to function and the army continues to fight. The war in Ukraine has shown that cyber aggression is not merely an auxiliary component, but a central element of Russian military doctrine. The threat will only grow for Ukraine and for its partners. Global-level operations attest to that. Back in May 2023, the FBI uncovered and successfully dismantled a highly sophisticated spy program that had been operating on a global scale for many years. For 2 decades, it gave the Kremlin access to confidential information in more than 50 countries, including NATO members.
Regarding NATO, no, Article 5 does not cover this. It isn't written into NATO's charter. The charter has hardly been altered since its adoption, only minor adjustments. Many now say action is needed because NATO, unfortunately, is lagging, especially when it comes to cyber attacks, to this new cyber war. Yes, they have agencies working on it. I should note, we in Ukraine cooperate with those agencies. We exchange data, share intelligence, and collaborate on protective measures. But this cooperation, while important, does not solve the fundamental issue of accountability. If tomorrow someone hacked an alliance system, for example an arms system, who would be responsible? This is a pressing concern, especially when it comes to nuclear arsenals. With the rapid expansion of the digital realm, the risks are no longer theoretical. Systems that once seemed secure are now interconnected, automated, and increasingly beyond full human oversight. In such an environment, there is no guarantee that tomorrow, at a remote console we assume is operated by a human, it won't in fact be artificial intelligence.
Moscow continues to run active hybrid campaigns aimed at undermining European security. The United Kingdom recently exposed a Russian intelligence operation that used malicious software for cyber espionage. According to the National Cybersecurity Center, the attacks were carried out by the hacker group APT28, operating under GRU control. In July 2025, the UK imposed sanctions on 3 GRU units and 18 officers involved in large-scale cyber attacks against the UK, Ukraine, and other states.
GRU spies are running a campaign to destabilize Europe, undermine Ukraine's sovereignty, and threaten the safety of British citizens. The Kremlin should be in no doubt. We see what they are trying to do in the shadows, and we won't tolerate it. That's why we're taking decisive action with sanctions against Russian spies.
Today, the sanctions cover 17 individuals, mostly GRU officers, and 4 organizations involved in the cyber attacks. Moreover, in July, 12 states, together with Eurojust and Europol, carried out operations against a hacking group working on Moscow's behalf. Investigators say it was behind many DDoS attacks on critical infrastructure, including electricity providers and public transit systems across Europe. An investigation launched in November 2023 culminated in the group's dismantling. 8 suspects were detained, including ringleaders living in the Russian Federation. Over 100 servers worldwide were taken offline. International arrest warrants were issued for the 8 suspects.
In cyberspace, it is extremely difficult to pinpoint a single individual as the author of an attack. That said, there have been successful cases in which our services have been able to identify the people responsible for specific operations. For instance, the US regularly adds North Korean officers, Russian operatives, and Iranian cyber actors to international wanted lists. Yet attribution remains a highly complex and meticulous process. Linking someone to a cyber attack requires gathering and analyzing an enormous amount of information, technological signatures, behavioral patterns, and connections to past operations. One of the specialized units within our team is dedicated to this task. It collects detailed behavioral and technological patterns, cross-references them with prior attacks known to be associated with the GRU FSB and similar organizations, and builds a coherent case. Only after this careful, often painstaking analysis can any conclusions about responsibility be reliably drawn.
What is the difference between a conventional static war fought on the battlefield and this new kind? In a traditional war, we know our enemy. We see him across the front line. In cyberspace, we often do not. The adversary may not even be Russian. It could be independent groups located in entirely different countries, operating under different citizenships. How can such actors be held accountable? No one has a clear answer. This is the war of the 21st century. Even if one day the fighting on the battlefield subsides, cyberwar will continue to expand. And there is another dimension, the relentless growth of digital technologies, especially artificial intelligence. If AI reaches a certain level of development and is integrated into national defense systems, particularly in nuclear states, who can guarantee that tomorrow an AI will not press the wrong button? Warnings are already being voiced. World leaders must convene and decide what is to be done with the digital domain, with cyber warfare, with the information sphere itself. Because today we are living in a condition of chaos, and without global rules, that chaos will only deepen.
Today, cyberspace is not merely the arena of separate hacker groups. The struggle is being waged at the level of states and intelligence services. They are the ones behind attacks and the architects of digital defense. The Kremlin marshals the full weight of the state to fuse cyber war with full-scale ground aggression. Cybercrime elevated to state policy by the Kremlin poses a serious challenge to international law and systems of collective security. Ukraine has found itself at the epicenter of this hybrid aggression, on both the physical and the digital front. But Ukrainian experience makes one thing clear. Effectively countering large-scale cyber threats is possible only through close cooperation between the state, business, and international partners.